Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kathy Hawks, Associate Dean for External Relations and Global Programs, and it is so nice to see all of your smiling faces. We are kicking off a fun afternoon here, and my main job is to introduce Dean Schmittlein. And many of you have known Dave for many years. He joined the school in 2007. So I won't go on and on about his investments in the school, expanding our degree programs, investing in alumni engagement, and the list could go on for a very long time. The fun fact that you do need to know about Dave today is that he teaches the most popular course, Corporations at the Crossroads, for our students these days, so we are thrilled to have him here. Over to you, Dave.
But I am mindful that you're not here to listen to me or to see me. And so I only want to take one moment, if I could, to have this opportunity, at least for many of you, to offer a word of welcome to the reunion. I've had a chance to say hi to some of you so far, but not all of you. I'm so glad that you chose to come back, see how MIT has changed, see in hopes that in some ways that are good, it hasn't changed. I hope you see some of that as well. Be with each other, maybe get back to the classroom a little bit, remind yourself about some of the greatness of ideas at MIT and from MIT, but especially to be with each other. So thank you for caring about MIT, and thank you for caring about each other. With that, I'm going to spend just a minute introducing Brad Feld, which is largely unnecessary also, but I would like to just mention a couple of things about Brad, and then we'll get started with a fireside chat. So, as you know, Brad has 2 degrees from MIT. He's class of 1987 and class of 1988. During his time, any class of 88 people here? They're all clustered. They're gathered for safety. They're in the back. You have the back row people in your class. They're my people. Yeah, I'm guessing that. Back row person too. That's Brad there, but okay. During his time here as a student, Brad created his first company, unsurprisingly enough, called Feld Technologies, which was sold successfully. As you know, he's had an extraordinary career as an entrepreneur and a blogger and an author and a venture capitalist. His association with the creation and growth of Techstars and Foundry, being an early investor in so many firms whose names you know, Fitbit, Harmonix, Zynga, and so on. He's had an extraordinary career. He is extraordinarily reflective in my experience of him about that career and about his time at MIT. And relative to MIT itself, he and his wife, Amy Batchelor, have been extraordinarily supportive of the Institute and of this school, including the New Venture Accelerator at MIT, Delta V. He supported our students with fellowships that enable people to be able to afford to come to MIT. And he and Amy are supporters of the MIT Sloan Women's Conference. There's a lot more to say about Brad, but really, he does it better himself. So would you please welcome Brad Feld. Hey.
Howdy.
You can just start if you want.
No, go.
So, Brad, we've never met.
Never.
As you know, thank you for coming back for Reunion. And as you know, Reunion may be a little bit of a time to look backward, reflect a little bit. So one of the things I'd like you to do is, and I know you've been walking around campus a little bit, so reflect on MIT and the Sloan School from your experience a few years ago, more than a couple of years ago, things that maybe stuck with you, things that maybe made a difference to you or shaped you in some way. So would you talk a little bit about MIT?
Sure. Why don't I start with, I'll start with a moment that happened repeatedly while I was here that I think frames my existence for a period of time. Whenever I heard Ed Roberts coming down the hall, I ran and hid in the 5th floor bathroom of E51. I was terrified of Ed, and I've become very good friends with Ed. I have enormous, enormous affection for him. But it typified a lot of my experience here. Yeah. I was with some I don't know, I can't see back in the back whether it was the same people last night. Yeah, it looks like a couple of the same people last night. A few of my classmates, and somebody said to me, "Were you in our class?" And yeah, and then I was talking to another group, and so he said, "Were you in our class?" And I said, "Huh, okay, yeah." I had this experience where I was an undergraduate my first year of Sloan, and I was a PhD student my second year. And so I never really felt part of a particular thing. I felt part of a bunch of things, which is, I think, one of the fascinating and powerful things about MIT is that you actually can be involved in a bunch of different things at the same time. I also had started a company. And for those of you that know the Mass Ave to here walk, I lived my senior year, so in '87, my first year, I guess, I lived in 351 Mass Ave, right on the corner of Mass Ave and Main Street. And that walk was my daily walk, once a day, twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day. And my first office was 875 Main Street, which is the building right next to Toscanini's. And Toscanini's was just behind my fraternity. So like my whole experience was, it's 9:30, I gotta go to Toski's and get my ice cream fix. But I had these things that were sort of different but linked together. That was really profound for me in terms of my own experience, that I could be in an environment where I could do that. Because if you think about my world today, I'm an investor in a bunch of different companies, and I help create a bunch of different companies, but I don't really work for anything. I mean, I do, I have a venture firm and I'm part of that. But I'm involved in lots of different pieces, and I get to have this experience that MIT really allowed me to have, where I didn't have to be sort of stuck in a corner on one thing. I didn't have to just be a this. And I think actually, when I think back to Sloan and my early experience with Sloan, that was a big part of it, is the ability to wander around. It is quite remarkable how different this place is 35 years later. I kept looking for the wooden chairs. I couldn't find them. It's really impressive how this part of campus has grown and expanded. When I was a freshman, Kendall Square was just starting its renovation. The Norton building was still here. I don't know if anybody, Al probably remembers the Norton building. I don't know if anybody remember the Norton building? It's a big white manufacturing building. Nobody, come on. It was awful looking. And it was like in the middle of Central Square. What was the tool and die company that is where the engine is now? Right? Like there was just a bunch of crap between here and actually here there was a bunch of crap.
Yes, there was.
So it's been pretty awesome to see, and that's been nice too. Like you kind of can't remember. I had dinner last night at a place on Mass Ave, and I couldn't remember whether it was Father's 4, which was a bar, and it's now a trendy, cool restaurant. So just that arc has changed, but the thread through it, like walking around, listening to people, being in a couple of the lectures the last couple of days, sort of the intellectual rigor, the intensity of it, people working on interesting things and caring a lot about those interesting things they were working on versus just working on them because, all that's been very powerful.
Yeah. And hopefully won't change about MIT while the buildings around us.
Well, when I come back and visit at my 70th reunion,
yes,
we'll see.
Yes.
I might be in a little jar with electrodes. Oh, no.
We're going to move on to the next question, I think. So, Brad, like other successful people, I mean, your history has pretty much just gone like this at every step.
Totally linear. Yeah, completely.
But if there were any moments that were sublinear, would you spend a minute or two on, things that might be a little more challenging than that along the way?
Yeah, I'll do a couple of points in time, both big positives and big negatives. I sold my first company 7 years after we started it. So we started in '87, and we sold it in '93. And I guess that's supposed to be 6 years, but it was really 7. That business was self-funded. We never raised it. We raised $10. We had 10 shares of stock, and we sold it. We had 10 shares of stock. So fortunately, they were worth more than $1 each when we sold it. But I really didn't know anything about investing. I didn't know anything about venture capital. We had no money, so I had to learn how to run a business. That experience had its big ups and downs. I mean, the experience of on a Thursday not knowing how you're going to make payroll on Monday hadn't occurred to me for a while. I hadn't thought about for a while until SVB failed. and then I'm like, fuck, I know how to deal with this, but I don't want to. I actually wrote a thing that I didn't have to send out to our portfolio, which is how to run your business on a cash basis and why you shouldn't pay your vendors for a week. But that experience was really profound because I didn't really know what to do. I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about building a business. I didn't learn anything about really building a business at Sloan. I learned some interesting stuff. And there were some entrepreneurial courses. I think it's still called 15370 or 71. It's a business school class. A guy named Russ Olive taught it. I remember Jeff Tibbins' book that was like $200 to buy a book to tell you how to write a business plan, which when you wrote it, nobody looked at it anyway. I learned stuff like that. But then, okay, now you got to get up each day and figure out how to sell. My wife Amy likes to say, make a widget, sell it to somebody. Like in the absence of that, you don't have anything. We had our ups and downs, but we generally were a successful business. We made money every month. But I had a moment in time when I was in my mid-20s where 3 things happened at the same time that ended up resulting in me, now with the benefit of looking back, having what was my first of multiple major depressive episodes. The 3 things that happened at the first time were, I got kicked out of the PhD program. I was a terrible PhD student. Ed did me a great favor by torturing me on a regular basis. Ed was an entrepreneur too. I don't know how many people know Ed's history well, but at the time he was a very successful entrepreneur. So I sort of had this mental model of, well, if Ed Roberts can be a successful entrepreneur and a successful professor, I can be a successful entrepreneur, a successful professor. And that was just false. I was able to do one, but I wasn't able to do the other. I had married my high school girlfriend. We split up. We didn't have kids, so it's more like a bad breakup in your 20s. So I had these 2 very public failures at a point where I'd really never had a failure, right? Like I was a great student in high school. I went to MIT. Yeah, MIT was pretty rough. I like to segment MIT. I say undergrads, 10% are just off the chart brilliant. 40% figure out how to muddle their way through. I was one of those 40%. And then for the other 50%, it's a daily assault on your self-esteem. Right? I was lucky. Like I wasn't going to be in the top 10%, but I figured it out. But man, that other 50% was rough. I hadn't had these failures, and both of these failures were very public, right? A social failure in a relationship and the academic failure. And then the third was I was bored of my company. I had a successful company. We made money every month. We had, good business, but I was bored. Those things together and just the physiological intensity of everything tipped me into a depression that lasted almost 2 years. I was very functional during this period of time, but it was very hard. And so that would be a low point. Selling the company was in the middle of that. It wasn't because I was depressed. We actually had a very good exit. And that was transformational because the 2 guys that were the founders of the company that bought mine bought a bunch of companies, and they sort of took me under their wing. And they were the co-chairman of the company, and they did all the deals, and then they had an operating president. And once they figured out what I was about, they said, look, Brad, we want you to be the technical guy on the deal team. So my job doing deals was to basically convince other entrepreneurs that whatever they had wasn't worth nearly as much as they thought it was. By not showing up and being a deal guy, but showing up and being like a nerd and like, hey, actually that software is not really that great. It's kind of shitty, actually. And I know you're kind of blowing smoke up everybody, And so that was part of my job. And the other part of my job, they said, Brad, we want you to torture the president. We want you to just be annoying to that guy because he doesn't have any strategy in him. He doesn't, he knows how to run this business, but he doesn't know how to move it forward. So we want you on what became a very rapidly expanding management team to be annoying. It's not so hard. And what I learned in that, I worked full-time for them for 18 months, was extraordinary. And simultaneously, I started making investments. I took almost all the money from that first company that I made and invested it in 40 companies in 3 years, which in the mid-90s was basically considered patently insane. Mm-hmm. Today, it would be pretty normal for an angel investor to do 10 investments a year, but in the mid-90s, it was like, this person, you're crazy. I promised Amy that we'd never get below $100,000 in our bank account. And I had very poor impulse control. So I remember having to tell her the day that we went under $100,000 in our bank account.
Was it only one day?
No, it was more than one day. But again, in this sort of context of, I was in now I'm in my late 20s, and the view is this is, in the middle of this experience of creating all these companies. So I put those two backdrops against each other in this very formative time. I've had a bunch of others along the way of that, but the dynamic is interesting because when I reflect back many years later, I had a successful business that for a long time I was very happy, but then I had a very deep well emotionally. And the business was still able to be successful through that. So the correlation between business success and emotional health and happiness, not necessarily linked. And by the way, they could be flipped, right? Your business could be completely fucked up and you could be doing just fine emotionally. And then on the other side of that, that dynamic of being willing to sort of just make change in the context of it, right? Being able to sell emotionally able to sell the business was completely transformative for the next 20-something years, 25, 30 years of my life. That if I hadn't done that, if I'd held on to that, or if I'd tried to constrain myself by that, I might not have ever had that opportunity.
You touched on mental health, and you've written and talked about mental health challenges, especially in the context of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. And this isn't just a story, it is a story about you and a truth about you, but so many others as well. And I don't think enough people in the violent ebb and flow of entrepreneurial activity maybe recognize how that can come crashing in. But I appreciate that you have been willing to speak and to share.
Thanks. Well, it's one of the threads of things that now at this stage of my life has become an important thing to me to try to address. And the way I talk about it is the goal that I have is to destigmatize mental health. And I actually like the phrase mental fitness in the same way that you think about physical fitness. I was talking with somebody yesterday about the distinction between coaching and therapy. Mm-hmm. And in a business context, they're very different things, but they're actually individually very useful, mm-hmm. but collectively incredibly powerful. And for me, the trigger for this happened, for this becoming important to me versus just my own internal experience, happened in 2013. A couple things happened at the same time. One was maybe a bad version of a country music song, which is 2012, from the outside, my life was awesome. And I did a series of things that are the country music song that completely wore myself out physiologically. I'm a big runner. I run marathons. I decided to run a 50-mile race because I wanted to see if I could get into ultras. I don't remember. I know exactly who suggested I do it. And fortunately, she ran it also, and it was the only 50-mile race she ran, a good friend of mine. The only way I can describe that while working full-time and traveling all the time is way too much running. But when I did the 50-mile race in April, I didn't recover. I didn't take a month off and chill. I just kept on as though nothing had changed. I came out with 2 books that year, so I did a bunch of stuff around the books. The book Startup Communities, which has become very well known, there was an awful lot of activity around that, both with the book and with Techstars and with another thing that's been important to me, which is this idea of democratizing entrepreneurship globally. All of those things really wore me out. And then in the end of summer, one of my partners had his 40th birthday, and we went to Slovenia. And on the second to last day, I had sort of a classic bike accident that was very bad, but in hindsight was near death, right? Like, it was one of those things where if I hadn't gotten lucky by inches, I would have gone over a bridge, and the bridge had a big fall, right? So, I got beat up pretty bad. But that was a moment, and it kept going, right? This is the country music song, and then my dog died, and then by the end of the year, I was so exhausted, and the men in the audience should pay attention to this. I went to the bathroom, and I had blood in my urine. Amy. And then like 2 weeks later, it happened again. And this time I mentioned it to Amy. And she said, call your doctor. I called my doctor. My doctor sent me to the ER immediately. Mm-hmm. Right? And it turned out to be a kidney stone, not cancer. Right? But it was one of those things where I was so disconnected from my physical self. Yeah. And I say the men in the room, I mean, the women in the room should listen to it too, the story too, and sort of take care of yourself. But I look at that as sort of an archetypically male thing. Like, I was just going to muscle through this complete exhaustion. No big deal, I can handle it. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't. So I had surgery. I took some time off. We have very funny stories about being in Cabo and me remembering nothing because I was completely stoned on Sackler food. I mean, oxycodone the entire time. And I came back and I went to CES. Anybody ever go to CES? All right, it's complete crazy. So I go to CES, and within 2 hours, I'm in my hotel room with the pillow over my head. I'm really depressed. Again, my life's going great. Foundry's going great. Techstars going great. My marriage to Amy's going great. I had just completely physiologically wore myself out. And fortunately, that was not the first depression that I had, so it lasted about 6 months, but I kind of knew how to deal with it, and I changed a bunch of stuff and the tactics quickly. But then I'm like, what's going on? Like, I'm gonna go dig deeper into this for myself. During this period of time, a couple of really well-known entrepreneurs committed suicide. One of them was a guy named Jody Sherman. And it was a total shock to the entrepreneurial landscape. And everybody sort of talking about it, but nobody doing anything about it. I'm blogging every day, and I decided that I was bullshitting myself if I didn't write daily about the depressive episode on my blog. And pretty much the only person that directly criticized me about it was my father, who said, don't do that. And so I just ignored him. He's my father. I ignored him. But what came back to me was unreal. I mean, over 100 name brand entrepreneurs, people whose names you would recognize, reach out to me, many of them saying, you're the first person I'm ever talking to about this. I haven't even talked to my partner. A number of them talking about what they did that got them through their depressive episode. A lot of them not really being able to process what was happening with themselves, but wanting to connect and reach out about it. And then a few people who were incredibly helpful to me. But when I came out of this depression, what I realized was the problem was not the depression. Mm-hmm. The problem was the stigma. Mm-hmm. And that it wasn't that there were any easy solutions for it, and that there needed to be rules and structures and how does the work environment this and that and the other. Like, no, it was not that. It's that we need to recognize that it's just part of the human condition. And that by putting a layer of stigma on top of it, it actually creates this huge negative feedback loop because it's that much more pressure to navigate through what you've got. And I've carried that on, hopefully with me and a handful of other people. There's a couple in Boston. Paul English has been, if people have not read the Tracy Kidder book, that's about Paul English, it's Truck Full of Money, spectacular, and incredibly brave of Paul to subject himself to, I think Tracy Kidder is one of the best ethnographic typewriters of all time. We were talking about John Van Manen, for those of you that took a class from John. I encourage it. Jerry Colonna, another name some people may know, an extremely close friend of mine, has been a huge advocate and effort on this. Another guy, Dave Morin, who was one of the first Facebook people. Anybody ever remember or use Facebook Connect? Mm-mm. Does anybody remember giving all their data to Facebook about everything so that they could then sell it and affect elections? Although apparently Twitter, Elon Musk is now affecting elections, so we'll see where that goes. The serious point on all that is, to the extent that we can address it, address ourselves internally and just acknowledge that life is not a straight line.
Yeah.
But then collectively, not just in entrepreneurship, but across all of society, say, you know what? Yeah. The stigma is not a helpful thing. Let's move past it.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
Yes. So I've got, of course, 20 questions about business strategy. But before we get to that, there is a question I think you know that I want to ask you about. There are many moments that I've had with Brad that I will never forget. Some of those I won't repeat here. But one of them I will ask you to talk about here, and you know the one I'm talking about. For graduating MBA students, there's a final last lecture, some years called disorientation, but anyway. So I happened to be in a room where Brad was giving this final lecture, and there were a couple hundred people in a room, kind of like this one, and something happened, and Brad, would you tell us what that was?
Sure. So I have a rule with Amy that we created in 2000. And 2000 was a moment in time where our relationship almost blew up because when the internet bubble started to burst, I was so immersed in work and I was paying no attention to her and our life as a couple. And I would say to her things like, you're the most important person to me. And then the phone would ring. And by the way, this is before caller ID. And I would say, hang on. Hello, it's Brad. Who is this? In the middle of pick your adult thing that you do. I would say to her over and over again, no, you're the most important person to me. And then I'd be 30 minutes late to dinner. And the fundamental glitch for me is pretty easy to solve, but it was that my words were not matching my actions. And it was a very simple thing that I had to change. And, being an MIT engineer, it was a rule-based, like, hey, Amy, just give me some rules. And at first, she did not like that. She did not like the idea that she had to give me some rules. That's not romantic. She went to Wellesley, so she kind of wanted some romance in that. But I got through that pretty quickly.
Looking for some other questions.
Yeah, no, I got through it quickly. And what I said was, don't think about it as romantic. Think about it as you get to control me. And she liked that a lot. That was very appealing. So, we made some rules. So one of those rules was that whenever she calls me, I have to answer, no matter what I'm doing. And this particular event that Dave was talking about was, I was giving a talk and my phone rang. I did not, by the way, ask her to call me so I could demonstrate today. But if she called me, I would say, hang on a second, and I would answer and say, hey, sweetie, I'm doing this lecture thing to a bunch of Sloanies. Can I call you back later? Yeah. Nice to catch. But it was changing and matching the words and the actions so they lined up. And they weren't really significant. They were a handful of things like that. So we go out a lot, so we don't have a date night concept, but we created something we called Life Dinner. And for Life Dinner, on the first night of every month, on day one, we would go out to dinner. And anybody here software developers? or managers in an organization that has software developers? Okay, that's better. So if you're familiar with the concept of agile software development, you have this concept called a stand-up. And you do a stand-up daily, and you do a stand-up at the end of the sprint and a retrospective. And the sprints are usually 2 weeks long, and then you do a retrospective, and then you do sprint planning for the next time. That's what we did on the first night of each month. We did a romantic version of Agile. It was Agile romantic development. But we'd sit there, and we'd talk about the last 30 days and how it went and what we did, do a retrospective, and then we talk about the next 30 days and what was coming up. And sometimes these were very short conversations because we were in sync. Other times they were not. And oftentimes they're tears, right? Like you're trying to deal with stuff. But that became very interesting, which is that you start to realize on the 26th of the month, if you're really annoyed with the other person, you're going to get together in 5 days. Like you don't have to have the fight right then. And it allowed us to have better synchronization. Yeah. What we do now, we started doing this in COVID, it was even more powerful, is we do something we call morning coffee. So each morning when the second of us wakes up, which is almost always me, we stop what we're doing and we sit and we have coffee for 15 to 30 minutes. Yes. And it ritualizes the start of the day. And what we've found now 3 years later is that the first night of the month, we don't really have much to talk about. Because we're kind of syncing up all the time. Like we have our separate lives, but we have a chance to really do that. I could give you another handful of tactics like that. But the point of it, in terms of the example, is that was really powerful for both of us to synchronize sort of our words, our actions, the intent that we had in our relationship, and then how our own behavior was. It also gets rid of a lot of the noise in the relationship where one of us feels missed expectation with the other. Yeah. Because when that happens, you can kind of say, hey, wait a second, like I thought we were signing up for this. Yeah. And usually the answer is either oops or no way. But you have a forum for like dealing with that.
Yeah. So you just mentioned relationship a couple times. There's the personal relationships, including spousal ones, also business relationships, team relationships, all those kinds of things. And you've written about that. So can I get you to talk just a bit about the distinction that you've made between reciprocal and transactional kind of in a context of relationships?
Yeah, so it's really significant. Everything I just said works with a business partner, right? It also works with a leadership team. It also works with a community that you're trying to build. And it's not reputational. It's the way you behave and sort of building in an underlying philosophical norm in how you behave. Interestingly, I think one of the best things about being a founder is that you get to create the cultural norms for your companies. Now, I use that phrase deliberately, cultural norms. I despise the word culture. I think culture is bullshit. I think when somebody says that's not our culture, they're just avoiding dealing with whatever they got to deal with. When an HR organization or a company says, we're trying to find people that are a culture fit, that's a pretty good sign that you should shut down your HR department and start over again. You want culture add. You want people that are going to extend your culture. You get to define the norms, right? The framework. But as the business grows and evolves, that culture expands. When it stops expanding, the thing becomes static. The really profound thing that came up for me, and it was probably 2010, 11, as Techstars is starting to expand into other cities, and we're having sort of a repeatable experience now. We show up in a city, run a program, and really create this vibrancy around the startup community. And if you go back to 2010, 11, there weren't startup communities all over the place, right? This was a global financial crisis that just happened, starting to come out of it. Entrepreneurship was still having the internet bubble hangover to some degree. It was starting again, but it was just starting again to be popular and powerful thing. And I came up with this notion that I called give before you get, which Techstars turned into a hashtag because that's what people do. in marketing. And the hashtag was give first, because I guess hashtag give before you get was too long. And what give first meant, it ended up having a very specific definition, and I'll define it so we talk about it, which is you're willing to enter into a relationship without knowing what you're going to get out of it. It's not philanthropic. You do expect, it's not altruistic. You expect to get something from the relationship. But you don't know what, over what period of time, in what consideration, from whom, and in what magnitude. So you're willing to put energy into the system, participate with something, but you don't have to define a transactional relationship up front. So think about the number of business interactions you have with people where it's like, hey, I'll do this thing with you. Here's the contract. We need to agree. Here's what you have to pay me to do this thing. Which is very different than saying, hey, how can I be helpful? Or, you're talking to somebody and you know that you're on the receiving end of a sales pitch, even though it's not a sales pitch. Yeah. Or somebody wants to motivate you to do something, but they're not really giving you an easy entry point into doing it because they're trying to set it up as though it's a formalized phenomena, versus just starting to do some stuff. Yeah. I found this in the context of entrepreneurship and startup communities to be extraordinary. Because if you could get enough people in the local geography, whatever that startup community was, to start putting energy into the startup community without defining transactionally what they were going to get back, you got this crazy flywheel that started to develop. And then all of a sudden, lots of good stuff started happening and everybody that was participating benefited. And there's lots of self-correcting phenomena. The person who only takes and doesn't give, like all that stuff sorts itself out more or less organically in those systems. I then started seeing that in the context of leadership teams. I hadn't been looking for it, but then I started seeing it where, and I'll give one very specific example. A CFO of a company and the CFO, I've worked with multiple companies, was extremely good at elevating the people that worked for him. And he went binary, positive or negative, on his peers. So if he respected his peers and things were working, everything was good. But if for some reason he didn't respect his peers or a peer and things weren't working, he went negative and really had no interest in engaging with that person. And it was very weird, different kind of behavior because he was extraordinary. I mean, he was the best, one of the best I've ever worked with at bringing his team up. And he and I had this conversation, and his comment was very simple. And he changed his behavior. He's actually become quite good now at working across the whole team. He said, when I don't respect my peer, I don't feel like I'm going to get anything out of the relationship. Yeah. And it's just going to be a tax on me. And I can't get rid of my peer because, I'm not the CEO, I'm the CFO. I can maybe politic, and I don't have time for that. I got too much work. I said, how about if you try it the other way, right? How about if you say, I'm not going to get anything out of him or her. How about you change it to, I'm going to help her until I start getting things out of the relationship. Yeah. So that construct, and you don't have to mirror a particular philosophy. I think the meta of this, what was the metacognition from our previous presentation earlier today? The metacognition point is have a philosophy. Have your own perspective, and then try to use that to guide you and let it evolve over time because it doesn't have to be static. Learn from it. Whether you're an entrepreneur or you're not an entrepreneur, you're in a large company or whatever you're doing. And for me, like when I reflect on now, 35 plus years of being in business, that's been the most significant for me, which is this ability to just let it evolve, have a frame of reference, have a philosophy, but keep learning, try new things, fail at them, but learn from that, and then try different new things and learn from them.
Thank you. That's really cool. So in a few minutes, but not right now, we'll open it up to questions from you all. And so I would urge you in the next 3 minutes to think of a question that you would like to ask Brad. And Brad, in the 3 minutes that we have until we open it up, I mean, this has all been great, but we need hard-nosed investment advice that we can use, like pretty much on the fly. And so
buy low, sell high. Here's another one. It can go to zero. Don't wait for it to go to zero before you sell it.
Building on that, you do take positions, angel investor, what makes something look to you like an appealing investment and not?
Yeah, so I've been through a lot of different ways of thinking about it. And for me, it's fascinating that what I started with as an angel investor in the mid-90s is what exists today for me. In the mid-90s, when I started making angel investments, and again, knew nothing about investing, had never made one, and didn't have investors in my company. I made about 40 investments in 3 years. I had very, very simple decision criteria. Number one, did I care about the product? Today I would say, did I have affinity for the product? I didn't have to be a user of the product, but I had to care about it. I'll come back to why that's important. Second, did I want to be partners with the people? And I always thought about it as partners, right? I had a business partner in my first company, so even if I was going to be an angel investor and own, 1.3% of the company or whatever tiny amount of the company I owned, I viewed that as a partnership. Did I want to work with them? Today, I've added sort of a third thing to it. And so the current view is very simple. First, do I have an affinity for the product? And the reason for that is I've been through every successful company I've ever been involved in had more than one near-death experience. And all the companies that I've been involved in that have failed had death experiences. The amount of intensity that you have to put into the company to try to get through that period where you have a near-death experience is substantial. And if you don't care about the product, it's impossible to put the energy into it. Second, are the founders obsessed about what they're doing? And the simple way to say it, especially for people that have a pejorative view of or concern with the word obsession, is were you put on planet Earth to work on this problem? Not for the rest of your life, but right now. I think the word passion is terrible in the context of entrepreneurship. It's so easy to fake being passionate about something. If you're an extrovert, it biases towards every extrovert and against every introvert. Obsession is a very different thing. And then the third is, do the founders want to work with me as much as I want to work with them? Again, that same partnership. And then within that, I invest in areas I know stuff about. I try to contain my universe to things where I think both I understand and can be additive. Those are a little self-reinforcing, but that's how I think about investing.
Thank you. That's good. And it's 3:45.
And that was 3 minutes. Pretty good.
That was perfect. So I think there are some people with microphones, and I'm hoping that there might be some of you as attendees with questions or comments. And so I see 2 hands in it. Can I do?
Yeah, go for it.
There's one here, and then there's one up. So let's do this and then this.
Hi, Brad. Thanks. I was just texting with Dave Moore, and he sends his regards.
That's nice. That's nice.
So Al and I here, we, as you know, we run the DC MIT Alum Angel Group. And I think we have been doing it for 4 years. And we're getting a little bit, I think we hit a little bit of, what would you call it, Al?
Quality on deal flows.
Yeah, quality on deal flows. So I'm curious with, what you have in terms of advice for us is how do we continue to foster the angel investor community with the early stage founders?
Yeah, I think 2 quick things. One is be patient. One of the things that I've seen over a long time period now investing is the definition of quality is unpredictable. And there are lots of periods that are not sort of up and to the right as the example, right? You're not always seeing additive everything. And it's particularly true, in moments where there's dislocations, in whatever industry you're investing in. So if you invest broadly in technology right now, there's tons of dislocations going on, positive and negative. The positive, which I think will start to be seen in the next 12 months, is so many people who have been either laid off or opted out of big tech company jobs, many of whom were bored as shit and were just making $400,000 a year because big companies were just collecting people, are going to start companies. And there's going to be a lot of talented people that start companies again. That's an example of a dislocation. Another example of dislocation is you're going to have a ton of companies go out of business in the next 12 to 24 months that are venture-backed. And that's going to then free up a bunch of people who are going to either look around and say, I need a job, or say, you know what, I'm going to start a company now. So that's an ebb and flow. It's not a consistent dynamic. The other is, and Gartner did such a good job with this, and it just kind of gets lost in the winds of time. But the notion of the hype cycle for technology life cycle is so powerful. And I don't know if anybody teaches that in any of the competitive strategy classes, but it happens every time. And an example of, if people are like, what's a hype cycle? An example of one right now would be this thing that people are calling, it's either AI or IA, I get confused. And the level of hype relative to signal, or the noise relative to signal, is extreme. And I think part of the reason it's so extreme right now is you have a very large VC industry, many firms with plenty of money, and they're trying to distract themselves from all the other stuff in their portfolio that's totally fucked up. And so the best way to do that is to play into that hype cycle. So being patient, again, is part of it, but also not necessarily viewing bigger is the goal, right? If the goal is steady progress over time, sometimes you'll have step functions up of activity, and then it'll be sort of consistent for a while, or maybe even dip down, and then there'll be a step function up of activity again. That would be my quick advice.
Thanks. So there's a question up here. Is there a question from this side as well that we could look ahead to seeing? No one on this side is going to have any questions, Brad.
Jeez.
They're going to think about it, though.
Oh, no, there's somebody way in the back.
In the back, but...
My row.
Great.
My row against the wall. That's where I always sat. I always sat in the second to last row, third to last row against the wall, for two reasons. One is I could escape, because you can kind of sneak out. And the other was not in the line of sight of the person talking. So I could daydream on whatever when I got bored of whatever was happening up here. Go ahead.
Wait, no,
or whoever's next.
Yes.
Hey, Brad. Several years back, I remember you coming and talking to us about immigration policy. A lot of things have changed in the last several years. In particular, other places in the world have changed how they deal with things. I remember you talking about the startup visa and the EB-5 and EB-6 here.
Yeah.
But internationally, things have changed a lot too. So just wondering what your thoughts are in 2023.
Yeah, the U.S. blew this. As a nation, we owned it, and we completely blew it. And now it's too late to own it, because it's innovation. Again, innovation, entrepreneurship is now globally democratized. In 2010, with half a dozen other people, I co-founded a thing called the Startup Visa Initiative. And it came out of us realizing how hard it was for entrepreneurs that wanted to come to the US or were in the US for some reason, couldn't start a company because they couldn't get a visa to start a company. And it was true for college students. It was true for people that were on H-1B visas working for companies. It was true for people that were here on other types of visas that just wanted to start. It was virtually impossible. We came pretty close a couple of times to getting something like a startup visa passed. The story of it is very challenging. It's all political. I learned a lot about our political infrastructure, especially around immigration reform. Became personally very cynical about innovation reform. At the very end of the Obama administration, they created a thing that was the startup visa called the International Entrepreneur Rule. And it is sort of it's a hack that sort of works. And then, of course, the Trump administration did everything they could to not have it happen. And the Biden administration has actually caused it to be a thing that exists. So there are ways to do it that are better than 15 years ago, but not much. Interestingly, many other countries took that idea. Canada did an amazing job with it. The UK did an amazing job with it. A number of European countries have done a really good job with it. And as a result, became much more attractive places for entrepreneurs who wanted to start a company in a country other than what their country of origin was. And as a result, build very positive feedback loops around that. And when I say the US owned this and blew it, if you look at the history of entrepreneurship in the US and the number of companies that were created by first or second generation immigrant entrepreneurs, it's extraordinary. And it's not a negative or positive against non-immigrant entrepreneurs. It's, again, back to philosophy. Like, we should be the easiest place in the world for somebody to start a company, because many of those are going to fail, by the way.
That's right.
But the ones that don't are going to be incredible drivers of innovation, economic growth, jobs, So for me, for a decade, I worked pretty hard at it as one of the threads of things. I still think that we should have very broad-based immigration reform in the U.S. I started a couple of nonprofits around it, including something called the Global EIR, which was a good hack. We used universities to get H-1B visas to EIRs that worked part-time at the university, because universities have an unlimited number of H-1Bs. And then when they started a company, they could transfer the H-1B, like stuff like that. But personally, like I think the phenomena that existed 15 years ago when entrepreneurship was starting to be vibrant again, the opportunity for that kind of U.S. staying at the forefront of it is probably, it's probably slipped away.
So we need a question with a more uplifting answer.
Yeah, that sucks.
So,
that sucks to end on. By the way, I'm still huge pro U.S. entrepreneurship, so not negative on that at all. I just think the ability for us to say, hey, we are the place in the world where anybody that has a dream to start a company can come and start a company. I think that narrative is hollow.
Okay. Do you have a microphone?
Yes, thank you, Brad. I really share your views on the dislocations and the second derivative, one of those regarding the companies, the tons of companies that you think are, will fail. What about those VC firms that back them? What will happen to them? What is your guesstimate on failure rate of those VC firms? And second part question is, what will those folks be doing next?
Yeah, so I think there's multiple levels, and it rhymes with what happened in the internet bubble. So I think it's worth sort of reflecting on that for anybody that can go back in time on that. If you segment it into three categories of firms, you have a very large number of early stage, pre-seed and seed stage funds. There will be less of them in 5 years. There will be a lot of people who thought that raising a fund was a really interesting thing, and they will learn that venture capital is a get-rich-slow business. They will find after they've made 15 or 20 investments, or they've raised fund 2 and they're now trying to build a firm, that it's pretty hard to do, and it may not be the thing that they were put on planet Earth to do. And then there's going to be plenty of people who just weren't good at that, and they will start companies or they will join companies and they will still have investments, but that'll shift at the bottom end. In the middle end, you're always going to have a significant number of firms, and now it's a global phenomenon, so you have them all over the world. But the growth in size of those firms in terms of people has expanded a lot in the last 5 to 7 years. It'll shrink. So there will be partners, there'll be less partners in those firms, there will be less junior people in those firms. They'll just get smaller because their next funds will be smaller. And then you have some very, very large capital allocators who are hedge funds that ventured into into venture capital, some venture capital firms that grew very, very big, And then some larger companies that were not traditionally venture investors, but that wandered back into venture capital at the later stage, that capital will contract significantly. So again, I think it's going to rhyme with what happened, 25 years ago or 20-something years ago. I don't think that's bad. I think it's just part of the cycle. And by the way, it won't rhyme and contract back to the same place. It has grown as an industry, and the number of companies getting funded every year has grown significantly. And part of that has been the globalization of it.
Okay, I think we have time maybe for one more question. Yes,
I'll
please.
keep myself to 3 minutes.
All righty, there you go.
2
We
minutes,
know you can do a
2
lot in
minutes
3
and 10
minutes.
seconds.
Brad, I loved your idea of mental fitness. I also had my first depressive episode during the first semester of my Sloan. And during that time, I decided, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do with my life. So started a chatbot company, actually. And our tagline was, your mental fitness trainer.
Oh, cool.
And we went through like Delta V and things like that. Since then, I kind of joined a VC firm to invest in AI and impact companies. But now back to the idea of mental health, which is what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. I'm exploring creativity, the idea of creativity as a solution for mental health. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how you think about creativity, and I guess within the context of how you invest, startups or happiness.
Well, it's easy to answer quickly. My mom's an artist. And so I grew up in a house where, in my sort of worldview, at least for many years, the most powerful woman in my life, until I met Amy, was an artist. And she created every day something from scratch. That's what her world was. Amy is a writer. So, the most powerful and important woman in my life now is also of sort, creative art. And if I think about my work, it's been fundamentally creative, right? I mean, the number of things I've been involved in that started from an idea and either turned into something or didn't. And the ability to be okay when it doesn't turn into something is similar to the idea of starting working on something. My mom, decides she's going to start to work on lithotypes now. And after a couple of months, she's like, this is not interesting. Now I'm going to try something different. Or, now having written a bunch of books, I've deleted more words than I've written, right? I mean, I didn't really understand that writing was actually getting rid of more. If you want it to be any good, like, you could write a bunch of shitty stuff, or you can generate something from ChatGPT, and then it's really boring and actually not correct. And there's this concept that I learned recently from reading a John McPhee book of greening. Do people know this idea? In The New Yorker, when they edit, and The New Yorker is the best, I continue to think The New Yorker is the absolute best edited and written nonfiction that exists. They have this concept, when it comes back from the editor, it says green 3 or green 8. And that's not words, that's lines. And so on this page, green 8, make this page 8 lines less. And you can take out a word here and a word here and a word here, or you can just delete a bunch of lines, like up to you, but get rid of a bunch because there's way too much here. And I think like that creative act is true. I mean, put the same concept against any company. Everybody that's in this room that's working on a project, if you went back and said, I think I'm going to green, 20% of what we're working on and just get rid of it. Or we're going to get rid of a whole series of things. Everybody, it's not people on your team, but everybody on your team, we're going to put all the effort against this set of things. You get so much more out of it. So it's kind of the combination of those. When you're at the very beginning with nothing, you've got to be unconstrained. And as you start to build that thing, you have to then create sort of a critical set of thinking against it to constrain it, because you can't cover the whole landscape. And all kinds of different ways to talk about it in the context of business. But when I ran into this notion of greening, I loved it. It's like constantly be editing what you're working on But recognize that when you start working on a new idea, you're starting with nothing. You got to let it go wherever it goes.
That's where we're going to have to let it go, Brad. But thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you. Thank you.